Now I would like to hand over to Osin from Ampos that will drive us through the survey questionnaire and the work that has he has performed over the last few months under the leadership on Rosie and John. So, Oisin, the floor is yours, and I think Pablo will share your slides. So, perfect.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Fernando. Good morning, everyone. My name is Oisin Cassidy, and I work in the Sustainability Department at An Post, Ireland's National Postal Service. Under the help and support of John Smith and Rosie O'Neill over the last few months, I was responsible for this year's ALICE survey and the communication between OEMs. So in this short presentation this morning, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the aims of the survey questions, an analysis of the survey responses to our future plans going forward, and then we will also have a review of the progress comparison from last year's survey corresponding to the survey response data from this year's data. Okay, so the purpose of the survey was to gather data on different OEMs for further research and strategy for reaching net zero emissions for ALICE members. It has been a challenge to get information from OEMs. This is largely because it is purely voluntary for OEMs to contribute to the survey and puts limitations to our findings. Nevertheless, we received a more positive response than last year with more details and insightful data. We are limited as to what we can share in this presentation about our survey responses, as we have confidentiality agreements with the OEMs who took part in the survey and respect their anonymity in sharing their data. Moreover, it has been harder to get sustainable commercial vehicles from commercial companies. But we are in preparations to start planning and integrating these vehicles and intend on keeping in touch with the market more and building on our knowledge each continuing year. This would aim to further develop a strategy for research and innovation to supply chain management and logistics across Europe. So in terms of the actual survey structure, firstly, we aimed to determine the viable options for zero emissions and sustainable commercial vehicles. Secondly, to develop a roadmap which identified the feasible options for zero emissions and sustainable commercial vehicles for ALICE members. And then finally, we hope to identify timelines for availability of zero emission and sustainable commercial vehicles. Next slide, please. Okay, so the survey was broken into three different parts. Part one was composed of questions related to heavy commercial vehicles, HCVs. Part two was questions relating to light commercial vehicles, LCVs. And then part three included additional questions around markets and sustainability initiatives that the OEMs are incorporating into their fleet for further data analysis. So displayed here are some samples of the questions relating to each part of the survey in relation to what data was trying to be collected and analyzed. Next slide, please. So the survey was sent to 32 OEMs all across the world. From these, we only received 5 responses. And while this may not seem like a lot, it is actually the same number we received last year, suggesting a similar interest in contributing to ALICE and sustainability-related initiatives in OEM fleets. Further data analysis, however, shows that there was more of a positive response in terms of quality of detail from last year's survey responses. And of the 5 responses received, only 2 OEMs provided answers to all 3 parts of the survey. And it's worth mentioning that we did receive more than 5 responses when contacting these OEMs. However, these responses were not filled to a sufficient standard, and so we are therefore unable to count them as a successful survey response. Examples of these responses include OEMs stating that they did not operate heavy commercial vehicles or light commercial vehicles, and we also received responses from OEMs that felt the survey was not suitable for them as they had not completed operations for their European market. Next slide, please. So as I said just there, part one was answered by all 5 respondents. In total, there are 14 different vehicles within the heavy commercial vehicles to be analysed. Of these 14 vehicles, there are 10 battery electric vehicles, 1 fuel cell electric vehicle, and 3 we were not given the details on. As you can see from this data displayed in the graph, the range varies from 150 miles to 700 kilometers. And in comparison to data received from last year's OEMs, we did receive responses of percentage cost difference between the listed sustainable commercial vehicles and the internal combustion engine equivalents. This was not received last year and provides greater depth of analysis to electrifying OEM fleets across the world for economic and sustainability purposes. And we can see from this graph the percentage cost difference to ICE equivalents varies from an additional 100% to 300%, so quite significant. And trials and appraisals across the OEMs will be available from 2023 to 2026, so fairly in the very soon future. And it's worth noting that based off of this data, we're able to conclude that the problems that OEMs are facing are that the market is not mature for heavy commercial vehicles, as the suppliers are niche in terms of expanding an electric fleet. And secondly, cost is quite prohibitive, and it is a barrier to entry into the market. However, we are seeing the operational costs lowering going forward, and that a benefit would lie in further clarity being provided to demonstrate the operational costs would be expected to lower than the ICE counterparts. And this will create greater accessibility and affordability going forward. Next slide, please. So for part 2 of the survey responses, this had a much less success of gathering data. We only received 2 responses out of 5 for the light commercial vehicles. And in total, there were 5 vehicles, 2 battery electric vehicles and 3 fuel cell electric vehicles. This is a much similar response to last year, and a percentage cost difference compared to internal combustion engine equivalent was provided for 4 of the vehicles we received a response on. And all of the vehicles stated that they would finish their production by the end of 2025. So quite soon as well. So as you can see from this chart, of the 5 vehicles, there are 2 BEVs and 3 FCEVs, like I just said. And it's worth noting that the fuel cell electric vehicle was listed in part 3 of the survey, but it has been summarized here due to the lack of response. And information relating to the percentage cost difference of the vehicles compared to their internal combustion engine equivalent was provided for 5 vehicles. And as you can see from this data displayed, the range varies from 250 kilometers to 450, so it's much lower than the heavy commercial vehicles. And the trials and appraisals will be available by the end of 2025 again. Next slide, please. So for part 3 of the survey, this consisted of additional pertinent questions we felt regarding the use of the OEMs was relevant, their vehicles and the markets in which they operate on. And we had an excellent response rate for this section, as all respondents answered all questions for the survey. And displayed here on the screen are some sample questions which we received responses for. We cannot provide answers to these questions, as it would violate anonymity and prior confidentiality agreements between ourselves and the OEMs. Once again, this was a much more successful response rate for part 3 of the survey than last year's. This is very welcomed, as it allows for a much greater understanding of where different manufacturers stand on their sustainability policy. And this also reflects the current markets in an economic and political way for understanding the timeline of different productions for different OEMs across the world and their sustainability agenda. Okay, so going forward, we plan on keeping the activity open and continuing to communicate with the OEMs. Those OEMs that responded to our response will be invited to present to ALICE members, and we had planned to review infrastructure for zero-emission vehicles. However, we now believe that this is premature, and therefore will review the infrastructure at a later date. We also plan on doing the survey every summer for the foreseeable, although this may change due to the lack of responses during the summer months. And we accept that this is not the widest survey possible, as it is limited and voluntary. But from this year's survey, our final concluding remarks would be that it's clear that the diesel market is falling, as people are not buying these vehicles and electric vehicles have not picked up in the market. And this has created a sort of a limbo effect, And going forward, we hope to see an expansion on responses of electric vehicles to improve sustainability and transport logistics all across Europe. Next slide, it's the last one, I think. Yeah, so thank you so much for listening to this. If you have any further questions or queries relating the survey or any of the responses received, you can ask a question or further discussion with John Smith or Rosie O'Neill by these emails. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oisin, for this. I think that the difference of P&O and this is that in this one we managed to get a little bit more insights, or we were trying to at least get more insights, and as you could see of what it's publicly available. But of course, that's a hard exercise.